Today we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. How far is a religious institution willing to go to protect its earthly power?
Yeah, that is the big question, isn't it?
It really is. Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description.
Glad to be here for this one.
So look, you might think of the Vatican purely as a spiritual center, right?
Right.
Like a place of prayer, theology, and just quiet contemplation.
Which is the public brand, obviously.
Exactly. But today, you'll discover that for centuries, it functioned as a sprawling geopolitical superpower. And like any superpower, it required one of the most sophisticated, lethal, and well-informed espionage networks in world history.
And that's not an exaggeration.
Not at all. The source material for this deep dive is Eric Frattini's exhaustive historical account, Los Espías del Papa, or The Pope's Spies. We are going to explore the comprehensive history of Vatican's secret intelligence service.
Right, which was known originally as the Holy Alliance and then later simply as the Entity.
The Entity.
Yeah.
It sounds so ominous.
It does. And it is a history that completely dismantles the conventional image of the Holy See. We are going to navigate through a labyrinth of historical nuances, strategic contradictions, and profound geopolitical paradoxes.
Because it's wild when you get into it.
It really is. When you look at the primary sources, like the intercepted letters, the declassified archives, you are confronted with the reality of holy men. I mean, priests, bishops, and cardinals operating as high-stakes intelligence assets.
Spies, basically.
Spies, saboteurs, and in several documented instances, engineers of targeted assassination.
Okay, let's jump right into the crucible of 1566. We have to look at the geopolitical powder keg of Europe at this exact moment.
Right, because context is everything here.
Exactly. The Protestant Reformation has severely fractured the continent. The Catholic Church isn't just, losing theological arguments at this point.
No, they are hemorrhaging territory.
Territory, tax revenue, and massive geopolitical influence.
Yeah.
Into this crisis steps Pope Pius V. And based on Frattini's research, Pius V was uniquely suited to militarize the Vatican.
He really was. I mean, Pius V was essentially the pope the era demanded from a purely strategic standpoint.
Because of his background, right?
Yeah, before wearing the papal tiara, he was actually the head of the Roman Inquisition.
Wow.
And we often think of the Inquisition in purely religious terms, like rooting out heretics. But structurally, it was a massive internal intelligence and enforcement apparatus.
Like a secret police?
Exactly like that. It possessed informants, interrogation protocols, and a highly centralized command structure.
So he brings that playbook to the papacy.
He does. When Pius V assumed the papacy, he realized that soft power, diplomacy and theological debate, it had just failed to halt the Protestant advance.
Right.
So he took the methodologies of the Inquisition and weaponized them for foreign policy. He formally established the Holy Alliance, and his overriding immediate objective was neutralizing the most powerful Protestant monarch in Europe.
Queen Elizabeth I of England.
Right.
But launching a frontal assault on Elizabeth is impossible, right? I mean, the English Channel protects her.
Yeah.
And her intelligence network is formidable.
Oh, yeah. Sir Francis Walsingham's network was legendary.
So the Holy Alliance decides to go through the back door. They look north to Scotland.
A very classic strategic flank.
Right, because if they can secure Scotland, which is currently ruled by the Catholic Queen, Mary Stuart, they gain a staging ground right on Elizabeth's border.
Exactly.
To execute this, the Holy Alliance deploys an operative named David Rizzio. And on paper, I gotta say, Rizzio makes absolutely no sense as a top-tier spy.
He really doesn't.
He's not a military tactician, he's not an aristocrat, he's literally a lute player from Turin.
Right, a musician.
How does a musician end up controlling Scottish foreign policy?
Well, by exploiting the mechanics of 16th century royal courts, you have to think about threat profiles. A military man or a known diplomat carries an inherent threat profile, right? They are watched constantly.
That makes sense.
But a musician, however, occupies a very specific, almost invisible social space. And Rizzio wasn't just some guy plucking strings. He was highly educated, fluent in several languages, and he possessed a brilliant memory.
So how did they actually get him in?
To get him into Scotland, the Holy Alliance attached him to the entourage of the ambassador of Savoy, who was already traveling to Edinburgh.
Okay, built-in cover.
Exactly. Once inside the Scottish court, Rizzio's musical talent provided him with something invaluable to an intelligence officer.
Which is what?
Physical proximity.
Oh, wow. He's quite literally the guy in the corner of the room providing background music while the most powerful people in the country discuss state secrets.
Precisely. And within the rigid hierarchies of the time, the people in power simply ignored the hired help. They didn't even register him as a threat.
He's just furniture to them.
Right. So Rizzio leveraged this access masterfully. He slowly transitioned from playing the lute for Queen Mary's private amusement to actually engaging her in political discourse.
Just casually dropping policy ideas between songs.
Basically, yeah. He gradually made himself indispensable, eventually replacing her private secretary altogether.
That is a massive leap.
It is. Suddenly, the Pope's embedded asset is sitting at the absolute pinnacle of Scottish power. He's reading highly classified correspondence, he's drafting royal decrees, and he is secretly funneling detailed intelligence reports back to Rome via diplomatic pouches.
Okay, let's talk about the counterintelligence work he was doing, because it completely destabilizes the English foothold in Scotland. Rizzio uncovers a massive, covert funding operation.
The huge one.
Queen Elizabeth's legendary spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, is secretly funneling gold to Protestant Scottish rebels to undermine Queen Mary. How does a former lute player intercept the intelligence of one of history's greatest spy masters?
By doing the unglamorous legwork, Rizzio utilized a network of Catholic informants embedded within the merchant classes and the ports.
Oh, right, because of the money.
Yeah, in the 16th century, you couldn't just wire money. Walsingham had to move physical gold and silver across the border.
Which is heavy and hard to hide.
Exactly. It required couriers, safe houses, and forged manifests. Rizzio's network tracked these physical movements and matched them with intercepted letters.
That's brilliant.
It really was. He presented this undeniable proof of English subversion directly to Queen Mary, and the result was a geopolitical earthquake.
What did she do?
Mary expelled the English ambassador, severed ties with Protestant England, and aligned Scotland firmly with Rome's strategic vision.
Okay, let's unpack this. Wait, so the Pope is essentially sending an undercover operative to manipulate a foreign monarch. Isn't there a fundamental contradiction between the teachings of the Church and running a covert operative that destroys marriages and kingdoms?
It's a huge contradiction.
Because Rizzio is spending long, private, unchaperoned evenings locked in the Queen's bedchamber discussing state secrets. This is actively driving her husband, Lord Darnley, into a state of paranoid, violent jealousy.
Oh, Darnley was losing his mind.
Right. So the Vatican is supposedly the defender of the Holy Sacrament of marriage, yet their agent is actively destroying a royal marriage to achieve a geopolitical goal.
It really forces us to understand the brutal calculus of 16th century religious warfare.
How did they justify it?
Well, to the Holy Alliance, the Protestant Reformation was not just a political disagreement. It was the active dismantling of God's kingdom on earth.
High stakes.
The highest. In that framework, the survival of the true faith is an existential imperative that basically supersedes conventional morality. Rizzio was viewed as a soldier behind enemy lines.
So Darnley's jealousy was just collateral damage.
Exactly. The destabilization of Mary's marriage was considered an acceptable collateral casualty in the broader war to prevent England from dominating the British Isles.
But that collateral damage results in one of the most visceral, claustrophobic assassinations detailed in the archives.
It's a horrific scene.
Rizzio's success unified two very different factions against him. You have the Protestant Scottish nobles who hate him because he's a Catholic foreign agent. Right. And you have Lord Darnley, the king consort, who hates him out of blinding, emasculated jealousy.
A very dangerous combination.
On the evening of March 9th, 1566, inside Kirkhofield Castle, these hatreds converge.
And the mechanics of the assassination were designed for maximum psychological impact.
Set the scene for us.
So Queen Mary, who was heavily pregnant at the time, was hosting a private dinner in her chambers. The room was small, the atmosphere was intimate.
There's music playing.
Right, and the assassins, they didn't storm the front gate. They bypassed the royal guard completely because Lord Darnley, the Queen's own husband, unlocked a secret door hidden behind a tapestry in her bedchamber.
Lord Patrick Ruthven is the first one through the door, in full armor, sword drawn. He's followed by a dozen armed men.
Just bursting into this tiny dining room.
And Queen Mary actually stands up and physically blocks them. She puts her pregnant body between the assassins and her spy.
Which is incredibly brave.
It is. Rizzio is completely unarmed, cowering behind her, literally gripping the pleats of her dress. And Darnley, the man who orchestrated this whole thing, is just hiding behind the curtain watching it unfold.
What a coward.
Unbelievable cowardice.
And the violence that follows is meant to send a definitive message to Rome. Andrew Kerr of Fodenside points a loaded pistol directly at the pregnant queen's stomach, forcing her to step aside.
My God.
Yeah. Rizzio is dragged out screaming down a narrow spiral staircase, and the lead assassin is a former Catholic priest named Henry Yare.
A former priest.
Yes, and he actively chooses to be the one to sever Rizzio's jugular. Rizzio is stabbed 57 times.
57 times. That is so personal.
It wasn't just a murder, it was a physical manifestation of Scotland's rejection of papal authority.
They butcher the Pope's top intelligence asset and leave his body at the bottom of the stairs. Now, obviously, you can't just murder the Pope's top spy and expect a prayer of forgiveness.
No, absolutely not.
This creates an immediate crisis for the Vatican. The soft power infiltration fails spectacularly. Rome has a choice: abandon Scotland or escalate.
And they choose to escalate.
Big time. This leads directly to how the Vatican moved from intelligence gathering to lethal, targeted revenge. They transformed the Holy Alliance from a spy network into an apparatus capable of systemic retribution.
Right. The failure of Rizzio's covert manipulation necessitated the deployment of hard kinetic power.
Pope Pius V did not view Rizzio's murder as a mere political setback, did he?
No, he viewed it as an assault on divine providence. To execute his response, he turned to the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits.
The soldiers of God.
Exactly. Founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, the Jesuits were polymaths. They were rigorously trained in theology and philosophy, sure, but their education also encompassed martial arts, advanced chemistry, and the physics of early explosives.
Wait, really? Explosives?
Oh yeah, they were the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation.
The operative chosen to lead this retaliation is a Jesuit priest named Lamberto Macchi. He's an aristocrat from Verona, a master swordsman, and an explosives expert.
He sounds like a fictional character.
He does. He sounds like a 16th century James Bond. But instead of carrying a license to kill from MI6, he carries a document called the Informe Rosso, the Red Report.
And the Informe Rosso is a fascinating legal and theological instrument.
Explain that, because it's wild.
So it was a scroll sealed with the red wax of the Holy Office. In the context of 16th century international law and Catholic doctrine, this document granted the bearer absolute papal immunity.
Immunity from what?
Everything. It declared that any actions taken by the bearer were explicitly authorized by the Vicar of Christ. It was a theological mechanism designed to bypass the mortal sin of murder.
So a literal license to kill, issued by God's representative on earth.
Basically, yes. It granted Macchi the authority to execute the enemies of the church without trial, and supposedly without risking his own immortal soul.
So Macchi travels to Scotland with a hit list, and at the very top is Lord Darnley. Now, Darnley has fled to a house in Kirkhope. He's suffering from syphilis, and he is completely isolated.
Karma, in a way.
Yeah. But how does an Italian priest execute the king consort of Scotland in his own territory?
Through a combination of stealth infiltration and overwhelming explosive force.
Okay.
On February 9th, 1567, Macchi and a small team of operatives breached the perimeter of Darnley's residence. They bypassed the external guards and entered Darnley's bedchamber while he slept.
Just ghosted right in.
Exactly. And the archives specifically note that Macchi employed an ancient assassination technique acquired from the Persian Hashashin.
Wait, like the original assassins?
Yes. He used a waxed cord to silently strangle Darnley and his valet, preventing any outcry whatsoever.
But they don't just leave the bodies and slip away into the night, do they? Macchi wants this to echo across Europe.
Oh, exactly. The strangulation was merely the execution. What followed was a psychological operation.
Right.
Prior to entering the bedchamber, Macchi's team had systematically packed the foundation of the house with massive quantities of gunpowder.
They rigged the whole building.
Yes. After Darnley was dead, they ignited the fuses. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. Reports stated it sounded like 25 cannons firing simultaneously. The house was entirely obliterated.
That is insane.
This was designed to project an image of omnipotent divine wrath.
And Macchi just sits there, pulls out the Informe Rosso, and physically crosses Darnley's name off the list using Darnley's own blood.
A grim little detail from the records.
The ensuing months are just a methodical, terrifying hunt. Lord Patrick Ruthven, the man in the armor, is tracked to a tavern near Oxford. A papal agent slips a tasteless red powder into his ale, and Ruthven dies in agonizing spasms hours later.
They got him.
And Andrew Kerr, the man who pointed the pistol at the pregnant queen, is dragged out of his home in the dead of night and hanged from an oak tree.
But the most revealing executions were those of Patrick Bellenden and Henry Eyre.
Tell us about those.
Well, Bellenden was found nailed by his hands and feet to a wooden beam on a rural road, crucified, with a cross drawn in blood on his forehead. And Henrière, the former priest who actually severed Rizzio's throat, he was found dead atop a tombstone with the exact same bloody cross on his head.
How does the Vatican justify crucifying a man? We are talking about highly educated theologians acting as serial killers and leaving bloody symbols on corpses.
It operates entirely on the logic of holy terror.
I mean, I guess.
Yeah, the Vatican wanted to instill a deep, paralyzing fear in the Protestant aristocracy. I mean, imagine the psychological terror this struck into Protestant Europe.
Knowing that offending the Pope meant an elite, highly educated priest might track you down and crucify you.
Precisely. The message was unmistakable. Geographical distance and political rank offer absolutely no protection. If you cross the Holy City, an elite operative who speaks your language and understands your customs will find you.
And your death will be a theological spectacle.
Exactly. The crucifixion was a deliberate mockery, punishing them for heresy while simultaneously claiming divine justification for the murder.
But that level of theatrical violence, it has a shelf life, doesn't it?
It really does.
It works as a short-term deterrent, but empires are not built on revenge alone. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, the geopolitical landscape shifts dramatically. Nation-states are centralizing power. France, Spain, and Austria are building massive secular armies and their own professional intelligence agencies.
Like Richelieu in France.
Exactly. The Vatican simply cannot field armies large enough to compete on a physical battlefield. They are forced to transition. If they can't win with brute force, they have to evolve to systemic, institutionalized counterintelligence.
Because the threat matrix fundamentally inverted. The primary danger was no longer a Protestant queen in a distant land. The danger was rival Catholic monarchs attempting to subjugate the papacy, and more corrosively, internal rot within the Vatican itself.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly. When an institution holds massive financial and diplomatic influence but lacks military enforcement, it becomes a prime target for infiltration. We see this perfectly illustrated in the late 17th century under Cardinal Paluzzo Paluzzi, who headed the Holy Alliance.
Paluzzi discovers that King Louis XIV of France has managed to plant a highly placed mole right inside the Vatican's most secure facility, the Secretariat of State Archives.
Right.
The mole operates under the code name Scipion.
Yeah.
How does an enemy agent operate inside the Vatican's inner sanctum without being noticed?
Well, Scipion was a former Vatican employee, which meant he already possessed the requisite clearances, the knowledge of the guard rotations, and a deep understanding of the archival filing systems. He wasn't breaking down doors.
We already had the keys.
Basically. He was quietly copying highly classified geopolitical correspondence during off hours and using a network of seemingly innocuous couriers to smuggle those transcripts across Rome to the sovereign territory of the French embassy.
When Paluzzi uncovers the leak, he revives a medieval enforcement unit known as the Black Order.
Oh, this is a wild story.
It's basically a paramilitary squad of monks. But Paluzzi doesn't use standard diplomatic channels to request the spy's extradition, does he?
No, he doesn't have the time or the patience for that.
Right. When Scipion's accomplice flees to the French embassy for asylum, Paluzzi sends the Black Order faces concealed, swords drawn to physically storm the embassy.
Which is a huge deal.
They drag the man out of sovereign French territory. And a few days later, the bodies of Scipion and his accomplice are found dangling from a bridge over the Tiber River.
It was an astonishing breach of international diplomatic protocol, but to Paluzzi, it was a calculated risk.
Why risk war with France over this?
Because Paluzzi needed to demonstrate that the Vatican's internal security superseded any secular nation's diplomatic immunity. The public hanging over the Tiber was a visceral warning to other European powers that Rome was not a porous intelligence target.
But this brings up a glaring paradox. If the Vatican is supposed to be this unified holy city, why are they spending so much time spying on each other? It sounds like they trusted their own cardinals less than they trusted rival kings.
That's because by the 1720s, the Papal States were drowning in institutional corruption.
Just rampant.
Oh, completely. Power had centralized, and with it came immense wealth. Cardinal Niccolò Coscia is the prime example here.
He was a favorite of the Pope, right?
He was, but he operated less like a spiritual leader and more like a syndicate boss.
Yeah.
He accepted massive bribes from the Holy Roman Emperor, he controlled access to the Pope, and he maintained a private militia recruited from the Roman underclass.
A private militia for a cardinal.
Yes, to physically intimidate his political rivals within the Curia.
So the head of the Holy Alliance, Cardinal Annibale Albani, realizes he has to take down a fellow cardinal. He launches Operation Iscariot. The goal is to plant Trojans, essentially moles inside Cauchy's syndicate, to gather hard evidence of financial crimes.
Right.
Albani deploys two trusted operatives, a Dominican priest named Fasano and a Franciscan named Valdo.
And the operation was an unmitigated disaster.
Why? What happened?
Because Cauchy's internal counterintelligence was ruthless. Cauchy's men identified the Trojans almost immediately, and their retribution was barbaric. Father Fasano was abducted, subjected to prolonged torture, had several body parts amputated, and his mutilated corpse was dumped near the Tiber.
Good Lord.
Yeah. Father Valdo was ambushed in the streets and stabbed through the neck.
This wasn't espionage against a foreign power anymore. This was a shadow civil war fought in the cobblestone streets of Rome between factions of the church's own elite.
Exactly. It was purely internal.
This internal paranoia creates a massive logistical nightmare. If the cardinals are assassinating each other's spies, who can you trust to carry a message?
No one.
Right. By the 19th century, this vulnerability reaches a crisis point. European governments, Austria, France, the new Italian states, they are routinely intercepting the Pope's mail. The Vatican's postal service is completely compromised. Their geopolitical secrets are being read by everyone in Europe.
This vulnerability necessitated a severe technological evolution. The Vatican could no longer rely on sealed envelopes and loyal couriers.
They needed advanced cryptography.
Yes. And Monsignor Francesco Cappuccini stepped in to solve this. Prior to Cappuccini, Vatican codes were relatively simple substitution ciphers that secular intelligence agencies easily cracked.
So what did Cappuccini do?
Cappuccini engineered the green code, which utilized complex additive tables.
Okay, stop right there.
Yeah.
How exactly does an additive table work, and why is it so much harder to crack than a standard code?
So in a basic substitution cipher, the letter A might always equal the number 12, right?
Right.
Once a code breaker figures out that 12 is A, the whole cipher falls apart. It's a domino effect.
Right.
But Cappuccini's additive system required the sender to first translate the message into a numerical code and then add a secondary randomized sequence of numbers, the additive key on top of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The receiver, who possesses the identical key, subtracts those numbers to reveal the original code. Without the specific randomized key, the intercepted message just looks like an endless, mathematically chaotic string of random digits.
But Cappuccini goes a step further. He realizes that even an uncrackable code draws suspicion if a known Vatican courier is carrying it. He needs a secure delivery mechanism. So he bypasses the postal service entirely and turns to international banking.
Which was incredibly forward-thinking.
How did that work?
He partnered with the Gupi Busoni Bank, which was a major Franco-Italian financial institution. Banks in the 19th century transmitted massive ledgers of numerical data across borders daily to reconcile accounts.
Just huge books of numbers.
Right. Cappuccini realized that his encrypted intelligence reports, which were now just long strings of numbers, could be seamlessly integrated into the columns of a bank's financial ledger.
That is genius.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
When an Austrian border guard inspected the courier's saddlebags, he just saw pages of banking transactions. The secrets of the papacy were hidden in plain sight within the machinery of global capitalism.
It's a brilliant pivot from the brute force of hanging spies over bridges. But this technological adaptation occurs against a backdrop of shrinking physical power. By the late 19th century, the Papal States are conquered and absorbed by the Kingdom of Italy.
The Pope loses his armies, his territory.
He becomes a literal prisoner in the Vatican. As the Church loses its physical empire, its obsession with internal security mutates into outright paranoia at the dawn of the 20th century.
Because when an institution's external physical borders collapse, it hyper-fixates on policing its internal intellectual borders.
Right.
As we enter the 20th century under Pope Pius VI, the primary threat identified by the Vatican isn't a foreign king anymore. It is an idea, an intellectual movement known as modernism.
And what did that entail?
It encompassed the rise of secular democracy, the separation of church and state, and attempts by liberal theologians to reconcile Catholic dogma with modern scientific discoveries and historical criticism.
But to fight a war of ideas, you can't use explosive charges or encrypted bank ledgers. You need an internal inquisition. In 1909, a fanatical traditionalist named Umberto Benigni builds exactly that. With the secret backing of the Pope, Benigni creates the Sodalitium Pianum, or the SP. It is the Vatican's official internal counter-espionage agency, and its sole mandate is to hunt down progressive thought within the Church.
Benigni was a dark visionary in the realm of secret police methodologies.
He wasn't looking at the old Jesuits, was he?
No, he didn't look to the 16th century for inspiration at all. He explicitly modeled the SP on the most ruthless secular security apparatuses of his time.
Like who?
Primarily, the Russian Okhrana and German internal intelligence.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is how he constructed a sprawling, invisible web of informants. Bishops were coerced into surveilling their priests. Seminary students were encouraged to report on their theology professors.
I mean, it's like a corporate HR department that has gone completely rogue, wiretapping the water cooler and firing anyone who reads a liberal newspaper. How did the SP physically manage this level of surveillance inside the Vatican?
They employed systematic mail interception. Benigni's operatives worked within the Vatican post office, actually using steam to open letters, copying the contents, and meticulously replicating wax seals to ensure the target never knew they were compromised.
Just reading everyone's mail.
Everyone's. They compiled extensive dossiers on thousands of clerics, tracking their reading habits, their social associations, and their private conversations.
And when they found a target, say a theology professor in Paris, who wrote an article suggesting maybe the church should support democratic labor unions, they didn't drag him in for a trial, did they?
No trials.
They used their own secret clandestine newspaper, the Correspondenza Romana.
Yeah, the Correspondenza Romana was a weapon of pure character assassination. Benigni would publish anonymous, highly defamatory articles accusing the targeted cleric of heresy, moral failings, or communist sympathies.
Just destroying their reputation.
Exactly. Because the source of the smear was untraceable, the victim couldn't defend themselves. Once the public damage was done, the Vatican hierarchy would quietly step in, cite the quote-unquote controversy surrounding the individual, and strip them of their academic tenure or parish assignment.
That's brutal.
The SP successfully ruined the careers of over 300 clerics using this exact methodology.
Consider the chilling effect this had on Catholic intellectualism. How many brilliant progressive ideas about human rights, poverty, or science were strangled in the crib simply because a young priest was terrified that the guy sitting next to him in the rectory was an SP informant. They literally referred to Benigni's network as the Sacred Terror.
And that name is completely earned. It created an atmosphere of pervasive, institutionalized paranoia. The tragic irony is that in its desperate bid to fend off modern secularism, the Vatican adopted the exact totalitarian surveillance tactics utilized by the secular regimes they claimed to oppose.
They became what they hated.
They did. The church hollowed out its own intellectual core just to maintain absolute ideological control.
But while Benigni was busy wiretapping his own priests and hunting for liberal professors, the actual real-world horrors of the 20th century communism and Nazism were rising outside their walls. These totalitarian states present the Holy Alliance with its greatest challenges.
Absolutely. The transition from policing internal theological debates to operating within a hostile, modern surveillance state was brutal.
Let's talk about the Soviet failure first.
Right. This is violently illustrated by the Vatican's operations in the Soviet Union. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist regime systematically dismantled the Catholic infrastructure in Russia. Executing or exiling the clergy.
Wiping it out.
Yeah. So to prevent the faith from being entirely eradicated, the Vatican launched a highly classified mission to establish a clandestine, underground Catholic hierarchy. The operative tasked with this was Bishop Michel d'Urbigny.
D'Urbigny's mission is to slip into the USSR, travel across the country, and secretly ordain new bishops and priests who will operate entirely in the shadows. But the operation is a catastrophic failure of tradecraft, isn't it?
Completely. D'Urbigny believes he is moving undetected, but the Soviet secret police, the OGPU, have identified him the moment his train crossed the border.
And they don't just arrest him.
No, D'Urbigny severely underestimated the capabilities of a modern industrialized security state. The OGPU didn't arrest him immediately. That would be a waste of an intelligence asset.
Right, they want to see who he meets.
Exactly. They utilized a strategy of permissive surveillance. They assigned teams to tail him 24 hours a day, intercepted his communications, and monitored every single person he met. They literally watched as he performed secret ordination ceremonies in darkened apartments.
They let him do all the work.
They allowed him to do the hard work of building the entire underground network for them.
And once D'Urbigny has mapped out every single hidden Catholic in Russia, the OGPU drops the hammer. They sweep in, dismantle the entire network in a matter of days, and send these newly ordained priests straight to the gulags to die.
A total disaster.
It's a devastating blow. But while the Vatican's intelligence apparatus failed in the Soviet Union, their penetration of Nazi Germany was much deeper, and the moral implications of those operations are incredibly complex.
Extremely complex. But let's examine the intelligence gathering capabilities first, which were remarkably effective. A prime example is Vatican agent Günther Hessner.
What did he do?
Hessner managed to infiltrate a Nazi racial marriage institute.
Wow.
Yeah, an SS facility dedicated to Aryan eugenics. But he didn't infiltrate as a scientist or an official. He got a job as a butler.
Which goes right back to the David Rizzio strategy from the 16th century.
Exactly. The people in power ignore the hired help.
But how does a butler gather actionable intelligence on state secrets?
By exploiting the physical realities of the workspace. While pouring drinks, serving meals, and cleaning offices, Hessner had unfiltered access to the waste paper baskets, the transport manifests left on desks, and the unguarded conversations of SS officers.
They just talked right in front of him.
Yep.
And through this access, he uncovered the logistics of the T4 euthanasia program at Castle Hartheim.
Oh, God. The systematic murder of the disabled.
Yes. The state-sponsored, industrialized murder of the physically and mentally disabled. Hessner codified this intelligence and smuggled it out of Germany to Rome. And this raw intelligence provided the Vatican with the undeniable proof required to formally and publicly protest the P4 program to the German government.
It's an incredible piece of espionage that leads to direct action. But the Holy Alliance doesn't stop at gathering intelligence. They get pulled into the lethal politics of assassination.
They do.
The Vatican has an operative known as the Messenger, a priest named Nicholas Astorzi, who functions as the Pope's ultra-classified courier. Through Astorzi, the Vatican intelligence network forms a clandestine bridge with the Abwehr, the German military intelligence agency.
Right, and the Abwehr was a unique entity. Under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and utilizing figures like Josef Müller, sections of the Abwehr were actively plotting to overthrow Adolf Hitler.
The German resistance.
Yes. They needed a secure conduit to communicate with the Allied powers to negotiate a conditional peace treaty, contingent on Hitler's assassination. The Vatican, holding neutral status and possessing a global diplomatic network, provided that conduit.
So Astorzi is the go-between.
Astorzi continuously crossed the highly militarized borders of Europe, carrying communications between the German resistance and Rome. It was an operation where capture meant agonizing torture and execution.
You have Vatican spies risking everything to facilitate the assassination of the architect of the Holocaust. It's a heroic, high-stakes narrative.
It is.
But we have to confront the dark mirror to this heroism. We have to discuss the immediate aftermath of World War II and an operation known as the Rat Lines, or Operation Convent.
This is the most fiercely debated and morally fraught chapter in the history of Vatican intelligence. Following the total collapse of the Third Reich, extensive Vatican assets, diplomatic channels, financial resources, and physical infrastructure were utilized to extract high-ranking Nazi and Croatian fascist war criminals from Europe.
Smuggling them to South America to evade the Nuremberg trials.
Exactly.
The primary architect of this extraction network is a Vatican agent named Father Krunoslav Draganovich. U.S. intelligence files literally refer to him as the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Nazis.
Well, a very fitting title.
He is operating openly out of the College of San Girolamo, a religious institution right in the center of Rome. He is securing safe passage for some of the most abhorrent monsters in human history.
We are talking about the worst of the worst.
We were talking about Ante Pavelic, the fascist dictator of Croatia, responsible for the genocide of hundreds of thousands of Serbs and Jews. We are talking about Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief known as the Butcher of Lyon. We are talking about Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind of the final solution.
Yeah.
How exactly does a priest secure international travel documents for international fugitives?
Draganovich exploited the chaos of the post-war refugee crisis and the specific mechanisms of the International Red Cross passport system.
Also,
The Red Cross issued travel documents based on identity verifications provided by local authorities. Draganovich utilized the Vatican's parish registry network to generate forged baptismal certificates and false identity papers.
he used the church's own paperwork.
Right. A Nazi officer would arrive at San Girolamo. Draganovich would issue paperwork establishing him as a displaced Catholic refugee with a new name. And the Red Cross, who were completely overwhelmed and trusted the church's documentation, would just issue the passport.
So what does this all mean? It's a massive contradiction. On one hand, Vatican spies are working with the German resistance to kill Hitler. On the other hand, Vatican spies are helping the worst architects of the Holocaust escape justice. How does the institution justify this?
It requires an understanding of a deeply cynical, purely geopolitical calculus that dominated the Vatican Secretariat of State at the time.
Walk us through that logic, impartially. What were they thinking?
Well, key figures in the hierarchy, including Cardinal Eugene Tisserant and Giovanni Montini, who would actually become the future Pope Paul VI, were analyzing the post-war map of Europe. They observed the Soviet Red Army occupying half the continent.
Right.
They believed that a cataclysmic global war between the capitalist West and the communist East was not just possible, but imminent.
And in their view, Soviet communism, with its militant state atheism, is the ultimate existential threat to the survival of the Catholic Church.
Precisely. Therefore, their moral calculus shifted dramatically. Once the Third Reich was destroyed, fascism was no longer the primary enemy. The fleeing Nazi and Usnash officials were no longer viewed primarily as perpetrators of genocide.
How were they viewed?
They were viewed as battle-tested, virulent anti-communists. To the architects of the rat lines, these men were valuable strategic assets to be preserved for the inevitable conflict against the Soviet Union.
That is just, wow.
Now, while the extent of Pope Pius XII's personal, direct knowledge or management of the rat lines remains a subject of intense historical debate, the structural reality is undeniable. The intelligence apparatus and funds of the Holy Alliance facilitated the escape.
It is a chilling application of realpolitik. Picture the surreal scene. Draganovic sitting in a cloistered college, surrounded by crucifixes, casually stamping the paperwork that lets the Butcher of Lyon escape to Bolivia.
That's a grim image.
It demonstrates that when survival is on the line, the entity will operate in the darkest corners of geopolitical strategy. And this willingness to engage in realpolitik didn't end with World War II. It continued deep into the modern era of global terrorism and the Cold War.
Right, because as the 20th century progressed, the Holy Alliance demonstrated its perpetual ability to adapt. The era of the Informe Rosso and Jesuit assassins was over. To maintain its geopolitical relevance, the Vatican Intelligence Service integrated itself into the modern global intelligence community.
Trading secrets.
Yes. They became an indispensable, albeit unofficial, node, trading niche, high-level human intelligence with secular agencies like the CIA and Israel's Mossad.
We see a perfect execution of this alliance in 1972 during the Golda Meir plot. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir makes a highly classified secret visit to Pope Paul VI. But the Palestinian terrorist group Black September, the same organization that orchestrated the Munich Olympics massacre, discovers the itinerary.
Tipped off by Mole, apparently.
They deploy a strike team to Rome with surface-to-air missiles to shoot down Meir's plane or ambush her motorcade.
And the operation to save Meir was a masterclass in interagency coordination. The Vatican spy chief, Father Carlo Giacobini, established a direct, secure line with Ziz Amir, the director of the Mossad.
How did the Vatican help?
Well, because the Vatican possessed an unparalleled network of informants within the local Roman infrastructure, it was actually a Vatican counterintelligence operative who first spotted the anomaly.
What was it?
A suspicious green Fiat van parked strategically along the route Meir's convoy was scheduled to take to the airport.
So the Vatican feeds this real-time tactical intelligence to the Mossad. The Mossad strike team speeds to the location, and instead of engaging in a shootout, they execute a brutal vehicular takedown. They ram the Fiat at high speed, flipping it over, and discover the terrorists armed with missiles.
Neutralized before they could even deploy them.
The Vatican's situational awareness literally prevented the assassination of a foreign head of state on Italian soil. It makes me compare the Vatican's intelligence network to a supercomputer. The hardware is ancient. It's housed in 16th century palazzos, guarded by men carrying halberds. But the software has been continually updated for 500 years, making it incredibly effective at surviving.
It is a highly resilient system, absolutely. But even the most sophisticated systems possess fatal internal vulnerabilities. In the 1970s, the Vatican's most severe threat wasn't international terrorism. It was the rot within its own financial institutions.
Internal scandals again.
Yes. In 1974, Pope Paul VI initiated Operation Nessun Dorma, an unprecedented, highly classified internal investigation into corruption within the Vatican Bank, the IOR. He tasked Archbishop Edouard Gagnon with running the probe.
And Gagnon's agents dig into the ledgers and they find a nightmare. They gather explosive documentary evidence linking high-ranking cardinals and Vatican financial accounts to massive money laundering operations tied directly to the Italian mafia and fraudulent shell companies.
A massive criminal conspiracy.
Gagnon locks this highly classified dossier inside a reinforced safe within the supposedly impenetrable walls of the Vatican. But the night before he is scheduled to present the findings directly to the Pope, the safe is broken into and the files are stolen.
Right, and the physical execution of that theft required intimate knowledge of the Vatican's internal security protocols, guard rotations, and the specific location of Gagnon's evidence. The safe was cracked, and the entire dossier vanished.
Who did it?
Well, the primary suspect, based on internal intelligence analysis and widespread accounts from the period, was allegedly the Vatican's own Secretary of State, Cardinal Jean Vigo.
A second in command.
Yes. It was an audacious act of internal sabotage that entirely neutralized the Pope's investigation.
It forces a profound realization. Consider the ultimate fate of Operation Nessun Dorma. If the Vatican's own intelligence agency cannot protect its files from its own cardinals, who truly holds the power in Rome? Is it the Pope or the bureaucracy?
It highlights the ultimate limit of papal authority when confronted with institutional self-preservation. Yet despite these internal civil wars, the Vatican's external intelligence operations remained robust, and that culminated in one of the most consequential strategic partnerships of the 20th century.
The Reagan Alliance.
Exactly, the alliance between Pope John Paul II and the Reagan administration in the 1980s.
Under John Paul II, who understood the Soviet system intimately, having lived under it in Poland, Vatican spy chief Luigi Poggi works directly with CIA Director William Casey.
A very powerful team.
They launch Operation Open Book. The goal is to funnel anti-communist propaganda and funds to the Solidarity movement in Poland, helping crack the Soviet bloc. But how do you actually smuggle heavy printing presses, fax machines, and millions of dollars in cash through the Iron Curtain?
They bypass traditional borders by weaponizing the church's religious infrastructure. The CIA provided the funding and the secure communications technology, but the Holy Alliance provided the logistical network.
Diplomatic pouches.
Yes, which are immune from border searches. They also created front companies in Western Europe to purchase the equipment. But most importantly, they exploited the constant flow of priests, nuns, and religious pilgrims traveling between Italy and Poland.
Hiding in plain sight.
Literally. A priest returning to Warsaw might have a dismantled fax machine hidden in his luggage and $10,000 sewn into the lining of his cassock.
They used the mechanics of the faith to smuggle the tools of revolution. And that joint operation was a critical fracture point that eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Which brings us to the core of this entire analysis. We have tracked this intelligence agency from the bloody spiral staircases of Scotland to the explosive assassinations of the 16th century, to the brutal pragmatism of the ratlines, to trading intelligence with the CIA.
It is a trajectory that forces us to grapple with the phenomenon of institutional memory. The Holy Alliance was created to defend a specific theological worldview, but over 5 centuries, it evolved into a highly autonomous apparatus obsessed with its own perpetuation.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. When an institution claims to represent absolute divine truth, but operates in the shadows using deceit, betrayal, and violence to survive, it raises a profound paradox. Does the requirement to survive in a corrupt world inevitably force the holy to become unholy? If the ends always justify the means, what happens to the soul of the institution? After 500 years, you have to ask, does the intelligence agency serve the religion, or does the religion merely serve the entity? We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs.